All right. Now our final presenter today is Dr. Tamara Wall, also with the Desert Research Institute, who's going to talk about asking the question, are wildfires getting more extreme? This is with interviews with fire behavior experts.
All right, so with that nice lead in from Tim, what I'm going to talk a little bit about today is a series of ongoing projects that I've been working on around this idea of, is fire behavior getting more extreme, but instead of from a physical sciences side, looking at it from a human perspective. So the first project looked at firefighters' perceptions of extreme fire behavior. The second project, we decided that we would talk to some very experienced fire behavior experts. So typically in the Forest Service, these are what's known as FBANs, fire behavior analysts, or LTANs, long-term analysts. Most of the people I ended up speaking to actually started their careers considerably before that. So we talked to, along with my colleague Tammy Parkinson with the U.S. Forest Service, who helped me identify people to talk to. I did a series of in-depth interviews. I've done about 12. Most of these were focused in Idaho, Washington, Montana, and Nevada thus far. I still have a few people in California and Southeast I want to sweep up. And we were also really careful to not define extreme fire behavior for either the firefighters in the first project or the fire behavior experts in this project. But easily, I would say that almost everybody I talked to had 40 plus years of experience, if not closer to 50. And so what did we find? I guess in brief, it was a really interesting group of people to talk to. They were really careful about differentiating between fire behavior and fire occurrence, fire intensity, and fire size. And if I was going to summarize it, I would say across the interviews, what they really focused on was that there's more opportunities now for firefighters to experience extreme fire behavior. In their opinion, the parameters of what fire is capable of doing has not changed, but there are more instances of it on the ground now. But they do feel that the physical variables around wildfire have changed, which I think both Dan and Tim and Don's presentations kind of set up nicely, as that from the ground perspective, they are really seeing this. And when I was setting this up, I went and talked to Steve Pine, who Tim mentioned in his presentation as well, but who is a fire historian. And he really encouraged me to identify people that started their careers early 1980s. And most of the people I spoke to probably started in the late 60s or early 70s, some as late as the late 70s. But his perspective was that there was a real switch in the late 80s, early 90s. And he really wanted me to try and interview people that had some comparison to that switch, so that they had some experience before that happened. And the people I interviewed definitely spoke about that. One of the other things that they really pointed out is that flammability, as Tim mentioned in his presentation as well, is that flammability is becoming really, really important. And I think this was a big issue in both the Northern California fires in 2017 and the Southern California fires. Also, I think is starting to get into those issues of drought, soil moisture, and how do both plants and the soil recover from multiple years of drought. I think there's a lot of questions around that, particularly as it gets to stand flammability. Another issue that came up frequently that they mentioned as a cause in this shift was the suppression that Tim mentioned as well, and also fuel stocking rates, rotation of stands, and then also post-timber harvesting growth. There's a lot of discussion about, as we have kind of entered into several decades past kind of peak harvesting records for the United States, that how decadent or overgrown many stands have become. And finally, I think as many of my interviewees pointed out, is that these larger fires are very detrimental in a whole host of ways, and not least that as these become longer duration fires, I'm thinking in particular about the King Fire or the Rim Fire that was in the Sierras several years ago, that these long duration fires really take a lot of resources. And I think will be real questions about the resources that we have available to put on these fires when they go for a month or longer. One of the origins of this project was from a colleague of ours at the U.S. Forest Service RDNA group. And he's like, I keep hearing, he's an incident commander, a type 1 incident commander, which is the top level of teams that handle the biggest fires in the nation. And he's like, I keep hearing people say, I've never seen fire do that before. He's like, I don't like hearing that. That means that somebody's getting surprised. So out of that statement came a whole host of questions that we've been trying to answer. And so I asked my interviewees, what do you think about statements like this? Do you think they're true? It was a great lead off to the interviews. And they had a bunch of very pithy responses. I don't think that anything really surprises this group of experts. Universally, when asked about fires that stand out, they all referenced fires early in their careers, which I thought was really interesting. I'd even try and prompt them a little bit and say, well, what about more recent fires? He's like, oh yeah, that was totally within parameters of what you could predict. But I think those fires earlier in their careers that really stood out for them were the ones that kind of put them on the path to being a fire behavior analyst or specialist. And so that was what really stood out for this group. And so universally, they found, I've never seen fire do that before, to be really annoying statements, I think would be, to put it mildly. In the previous project I mentioned where we interviewed wildland firefighters about their, we actually didn't interview them, but we got their narratives and stories about what they thought of as extreme fire behavior. In particular, we asked them to identify if it was inexplicable or erratic behavior. And when I took those story narratives to fire behavior experts, almost all of them universally responded just like this interviewee did, which was that, even in these very short narratives, they're like, no, that behavior was totally predictable. They should have seen that coming. And so I think that points to some potential challenges in training that I'll talk about a little bit later as well. And I thought this interviewee really captured this very nicely, is that one of the things that many of the people I talked to commented on was the swiftness of fire growth and the potential growth. I think California in 2017 really showed when, all of the cheese holes line up, all the flammability, the fire weather, the topography, the fuel loading, the flammability of the fuels, fire can progress very, very rapidly. And I think that a lot of the new tools that we're building now are really looking at not just forecasting fire weather, but also forecasting large fire growth potential. A really good example of that is the Santa Ana Winds Threat Index, which was used very heavily in Southern California in 2017. And it is very specific to Southern California. And it's also specific to Santa Ana wind-driven wildfire events and looks very specifically at the potential of large fire growth. potential. And so, as Tim started to allude to a little bit, you could argue that, you know, we don't have a fire behavior problem. It's not that fire behavior is becoming more extreme, but if that's the case, well, then what is the problem with fire? And as Tim mentioned, I'm not sure if actually, Tim, you brought up the National Cohesive Strategy, but this is a national wildland fire management strategy that is interagency. And it has three different components that it looks at. One is resilient communities. The other is basically fire response. And then I'm going to forget the third one right off the top of my head right now. But it is really trying to take a different tact with fighting wildfire. And I thought that this interviewee captured it really, really nicely, is that, as Steve Pine would point out, we don't have a fire problem. We have a social and a political problem. I also asked my wildfire experts about what would be needed in the future, and not surprisingly, they said more fire behavior experts. As we have more and more of this kind of extreme fire behavior on the ground with higher intensities that is moving more swiftly and more rapidity, there's really going to be a need to have people who are capable of predicting this and not being surprised by it, and giving that information to the people in charge so that they can make the best decisions. I think this gets into some training opportunities for the fire management agencies and risk assessment, and also perhaps dealing with the lack of prescribed fire. One factor that came up many times throughout these interviews was the role of prescribed fire in all of their careers, and kind of giving them a safer place to really experience fire and understand what it could do, and to really watch it, often for very long durations in conditions that were safer than a wildland fire. And generally, we've seen a reduction in prescribed fire, particularly in the Western United States, for a whole host of reasons. Often it has to do with air quality, and concerns about smoking out different communities. But I think that lack of prescribed fire is going to be very detrimental to our future wildland firefighters and their ability to assess risk, and also the training opportunities it provides to firefighters. I also asked everyone about what does the future look like, and they all kind of spoke to this idea of a need for changing strategy, of not just making war on fire. And they also mentioned the role of people, just as Tim did in his presentation, about more and more people are moving, to these WUI areas. Whether that's in the Sierras or along the Rocky Mountain front in Colorado. And I don't think that that's going to change anytime soon. As Patty Limerick once said, the baby boomers kind of grew up mythologizing the West, through various TV shows. And, now they're grown up and they have checkbooks. And I think as the baby boomer cohort really moves into retirement, we're going to continue to see growth in these areas. And I think that will require a change in strategy, which is what the cohesive strategy is trying to do. But that will then, to do this, to not just have a donut strategy around homes, we really are going to have to do prescribed fire, mechanical thinning treatments, and create those mosaics where fire can move safely around homes, or safer around homes. In my last slide, this was a group of experts that, had all retired, some of them as many as 20 years ago. They still worked actively, but they have not been, many of them had not actually worked for a fire management agency directly as an employee for a number of years. And so they were pretty comfortable, I think, making some hard statements. And I've thought a lot about the last part of this, which is not only should it be expected, but that it should be acceptable that that's going to be the outcome, about what this individual really meant with this. And I'm still not entirely sure. I don't think he meant that it's acceptable that homes would be burned, but I think he means that there's often real trade-offs between wildland firefighter safety and protecting infrastructure and homes. And I think what he was kind of getting at here was that we are going to lose homes. That's the nature of if people are building in these areas, as Tim showed in the, with the Tubbs fire, how the home density had really changed from 1940 through the current time, that homes are going to burn. And that we shouldn't lead people to expect that we can always protect their homes. Thanks. And just so you know, funding for this project was provided by 2 different agencies, the U.S. Forest Service Wildland Fire and Management Research Development and Application Unit, otherwise known as Wildfire RDA, and also CNAP, which is part of the NOAA RESA network. Thank you.
Thanks, Tamara.